Well, everyone, just to let you know, we'll start the presentation in about a minute. We're just waiting for everyone to get in and get settled. Just to let everyone know, we will start the presentation in about 20 to 30 seconds. We're just still waiting for everyone to get in and get settled. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Safety and Health Magazine webcast. Beat the Heat, your guide to building your heat stress program. Sponsored by J.J. Keller. This is Alan Ferguson. I'm Associate Editor at Safety and Health, and I'll be moderating today's event. Thank you for joining us, and before we get started, there are a few housekeeping items. As a disclaimer, the views of today's speakers and organization are their own and do not necessarily reflect those in the National Safety Council or Safety and Health Magazine. Any mention of a commercial enterprise, product, or publication does not mean the council or the magazine endorses those items. After today's presentation, we'll conduct a Q&A with our speakers. If you have a question, click the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, type your question, and press the send button. We welcome your questions at any time during today's event. You don't have to wait for the Q&A to begin. We might not get to every question, but the good news is that unanswered questions will be forwarded to today's sponsor. Also, after this presentation, we asked to complete a brief evaluation survey, and I'll tell you more about that a little bit later. This webcast will be archived so you can access it after today's live event. To view this webcast and all of our past webcasts, please visit safetyandhealthmagazine.com/events, or you may receive a link in our post-event email. With that, let's introduce our speakers. With us today are Ray Chisty and Ed Zaleski. Ray joined J.J. Keller in 2017 as a workplace safety editor and has 15 years of EHS experience, including construction, railway, fossil fuel power plants, and electrical transmission. Ed is a senior EHS editor with J.J. Keller. He creates content on a variety of safety-related topics, specializing in issues that include walking, working surfaces, powered industrial trucks, and injury and illness record keeping. Again, we thank you all for tuning in this presentation. Ray, whenever you're ready, go ahead and take it away.
All right, terrific. Thank you for that warm welcome, and we're happy to have everybody join us today. Good afternoon. Today's webcast is presented by the J.J. Keller Safety Management Suite. The Safety Management Suite streamlines compliance at every level of your business, making it easy to develop, implement, and maintain an industry-specific safety program. And because your success is our priority, today's attendees will be offered complimentary access to our compliance tools and resources in the Safety Management Suite. And on behalf of J.J. Keller Safety Management Suite, again, thank you everybody for joining us during this webcast. All right, so I know that this seems a bit odd, but I wanted to cover a little bit about cold stress in the workplace before we get into the heat stress part. So many of us don't want to worry about summer winding down, right? It's already July and it's, fall is poking us around the corner. But you can't forget about what you're doing for your employees' protections when it comes to cold stress as well. For those of you that follow an OSHA state plan, perhaps you're in New York, Minnesota, Virginia, Cal OSHA is another big one. There's others. Do think about your state's regulations surrounding both cold and heat stress. And in a matter of fact, not just even outdoors, but indoors as well, as we'll be talking about during the webcast today. So, in indoor situations, you could have workers perhaps working in a cooler, maybe a freezer, maybe it's a cold work environment. Somebody's cranked down the AC in the office kind of thing. So you want to keep those local jurisdiction regulations in mind as we go through today's webcast as well. Also remember, feel free to send us your questions, Ed and I. You can do that by putting your questions in the Q&A box, and we would be more than happy to get those answered for you as we go through today's webcast. We'll certainly reserve some time at the end of today's session to answer your questions. So heat stress has long been recognized, right, by workplaces and safety professionals, managers, those of us that are responsible for safety, right? And it exposes employees to things like heat stroke, dehydration, fatigue, and other serious illnesses that we'll be covering in just a bit. So, temperature management at your workplace is going to be very important. And that's going to be the core conversation that we'll have with you guys here today on how to manage that. OSHA doesn't have a heat stress requirement. We'll be talking through what that means and what's coming down the pike. But as you can see up on the slide, the emphasis of today's webcast is going to be centered around a bit of conversation around OSHA's National Emphasis Program. We'll touch on that, what that means. We'll talk about heat stress. Who's at risk? You know, are there certain groups, one over the other? Your workers, certainly. We'll talk about why you should be concerned about heat stress in your workplace, how to identify heat stress. We'll be talking about signs and symptoms and things like that. And we'll also be covering what you can do to mitigate the risk in your workplace. So before we get into the meat and potatoes of today's webcast, I thought I would just spend a little bit of time outlining some of the updates centered around heat stress. So if you remember back in last year, around September, OSHA had issued a statement saying that it would increase its measures to protect workers from the heat, right? And OSHA kept good on its word. And we saw earlier this year in April, OSHA increased its inspection efforts under a national emphasis program of both outdoor and indoor workplaces. And this was an attempt, in their attempt to help prevent heat-related injury and illness in workplaces nationally. Now, the program requires that each of the OSHA regions raises its numbers of heat-related inspections by 100% over the past 5-year average of those inspections that they've been doing. We also saw things like last year, the fall 2021 OSHA Unified Agenda talked about heat illness prevention in outdoor and indoor work settings. We saw that it had set the topic of heat stress as a pre-rule. And a pre-rule is basically where OSHA announces a rulemaking and then asks a series of questions through an advance notice of proposed rulemaking. And we saw that advance notice of proposed rulemaking in October of last year. And really between October and now, we've seen this, we've seen the comment period come to a close. We saw in May, around May of this year, May 3rd, OSHA hosted a virtual public webcast where they had talked about opportunities to learn and comment on their efforts centered around heat-related hazards and their proposed rulemaking. It was also an opportunity to hear about the agency's rulemaking process and ways for the public like us to participate. We also saw the spring 2022 Unified Agenda of Regulatory Actions come out talking about heat stress. We saw that OSHA was still reviewing comments from its proposed rulemaking as of June. So there's lots of activities at the agency level centered around heat stress and regulatory movement. So that brings us to current, what's kind of going on in the OSHA world. So what does this mean for you? So remember that employers covered under the OSHA Act, right? They're encouraged to implement early interventions to prevent illness and death amongst their workers regarding workers working in high heat conditions. And this might be something like maybe you have an employee or workers working outdoors in a local area that's experiencing a heat wave of sorts, or maybe they're working indoors where temperatures and work itself can contribute to heat stress. When I say early intervention, what I'm talking about is the way that you plan to control your environmental hazards like heat stress. And this might be something like simply providing water, having a rest regimen, providing shade for your outdoor workers, doing awareness training, allowing workers to adjust between environments. So maybe you have a worker that's transitioning from an inside cool area to an outdoor environment that's now hot and humid. So essentially, if employees could potentially be exposed to heat stress or other heat-related hazards on the job, you need to protect them via a formal process, right? And what that formal process should look like, we are talking about here with you today. So, of course, OSHA can't cite an employer under a heat standard because there isn't one yet, but they can use the general duty clause, though, if employer fails to show that they've set up a program to protect their workers. And that's something that's not out of the realm of possibilities. We've seen that in the past. So keep in mind, I touched on it a little bit, the National Emphasis Program. A key to remember there is that it's not a standard. It's just simply a way that OSHA encourages employers to put in place a heat stress program, in this case, to prevent heat-related illnesses and injuries in employees. So again, remember, this National Emphasis Program is not a standard. And some might say that OSHA's issuance of the Emphasis Program was their step in the direction of setting a regulatory standard around heat stress or what have you. And I think the updates that I mentioned earlier point towards that. Remember also that a standard specific to heat-related injury and illness prevention, what that's going to allow is it's going to clearly set forth your employer obligations and duties. What are you required via the standard to do in terms of protections for heat stress when it comes to your workers? Remember that the ultimate goal is always going to be to prevent and reduce the number of occupational injuries, illnesses, fatalities that could occur centered around heat stress injuries. And with that, I'm going to pass the torch on to Ed.
Thank you, Ray. Now, as Ray was saying, there isn't an OSHA standard on heat stress right now, but OSHA has used the general duty clause, as he mentioned earlier. That, if you're hopefully familiar with it, requires every employer to provide a place of employment that is free from recognized hazards. So in theory, if you're aware of warm temperatures, whether indoors or outdoors, can be indoors, especially in bakeries or foundries, places like that. If that can present a hazard to your workers, you do need to take steps to mitigate that. Now, one of the reasons OSHA is looking at developing a standard is they found some frustrations with using the general duty clause. They can use it, but they need to show both that a hazard existed and that the employer knew a hazard existed in every single case. And actually, the request for information that they posted that Ray talked about, they literally wrote in there that once they develop a standard, the hazard is assumed to exist. They've outlined that. And if they put in things like training, they can cite you for not doing the training. Under the general duty clause, some of that's a little more challenging for them. Now, keep in mind, of course, there are other regulations. They're not specifically meant to address heat hazards, but they can come into play. One of them is the personal protective equipment. The requirements at 1910-132 says that if you require employees to bring their own PPE, like moist towels and bandanas, that you make sure the PPE is adequate to protect them. Heat can be something that PPE could be used to protect against, things like those cooling towels. Now, if you provide the PPE, you do have to make sure employees know how to use the equipment and provide training in how to use it. And of course, the PPE standards also talk about evaluating hazards, doing a hazard assessment. Well, heat can be an assessment. If you're wearing, those chemical suits, the Tyvek suits and things like that, that can affect, when working in high temperatures, it can affect the body's ability to cool itself. So these are all considerations. It's also important to understand heat stress before you can attack the problem. Now, heat stress is the effect that when warmer than normal temperatures kind of take a toll on the body. And of course, there's ambient temperature and there's also physical exertion. But we kind of want to look at three main factors that come into play. The main one is the ambient air temperature. And this is because obviously the warmer it is, the harder the body has to work to cool itself down. And the harder the body works, well, the faster the worker can become fatigued. Now, it's not listed in, I'm kind of lumping with air temperature as sunlight, because in direct sunlight, the feels like temperature can be 10 or 15 degrees higher than the measured temperature. Air movement is another huge factor. If you think about those hot summer days when you're outside and you think I could really use that breeze right now, or when the breeze comes up and you just raise your arms and enjoy it. Well, obviously air movement works with sweat to keep the body cool. Now, if there's a lack of air movement, it's harder for the body to regulate heat, but it can help lower the feels like temperature a little bit on a nice breezy day. And of course, one factor that can increase risk is the length of exposure. The longer that employees are exposed to warm temperatures, and frankly, the longer that they're doing physically difficult activity, the greater their chance of heat stress. So here we're talking about like construction workers, frankly, even indoor workers can deal with this on hot summer days where your indoor areas might not have decent climate control. And sometimes it's just very difficult to have that. So just a few things to keep in mind. And with that, I'm going to turn it back to Ray to talk a little bit more about some risks.
All right, terrific. Thank you, Ed. Good information. So looking at who's at risk at your workplace, I find that a lot of employers a lot of times will make the mistake of thinking only outdoor workers are at risk to heat stress. And what I recommend is that you look at any worker, you look at anybody that's going to be in your workplace, in your facility. It could be vendors, it could be suppliers, your workers, it could be contractors, anybody. So up on the screen there, you can see some examples I've put out there, outdoor, indoor. If you're working outdoors, certainly in a construction environment, those workers are at risk. Electrical workers, tree cutters. So if you got landscapers or what have you, maybe you have grounds persons where they're going out and doing facility management. If you have a security team or police officers, they could be at risk. Emergency response personnel, fire response personnel. In an indoor environment, you could have your manufacturing workers. You could have equipment. So maybe you have conveyors or food processing equipment that are producing heat, and you got workers working next to those pieces of equipment that are exposed to that heat coming from the equipment. You could have a hot warehouse. You could be in a retail setting. You could have hot work or welding operations going on. So those are just some examples that I've come across in my career, but I would certainly make an assessment of your workplace 360 degrees, account for everybody, not just individual workers, but looking at the larger groups as well. Include them inside of your risk analysis and in your program. As I mentioned, indoor workers, you'll want to keep in mind that they obviously are exposed or could be exposed to risk for heat stress. As I mentioned, a lot of the equipment that you can find inside of facilities are producing heat, and you could have workers wearing PPE, maybe aprons, certain types of clothing that will increase their risk to heat stress sensitivities. So if you're in a manufacturing, a food processing setting, a warehouse, retail, and as I mentioned, the welding operations that frequently occur in facilities, you want to be mindful of that. Think about any places really inside of your work environments that could be kept warm even during the winter months as we inch towards the fall and the winter months towards the end of the year. Think about those things. Overheating can happen anywhere indoors, given the right circumstances. So remember that. This is a question that we get often, and you think it would be simple, and maybe a silly question, but really, what is warm or hot? Defining heat in the workplace is a bit tricky, I think. When it comes to warm for one person, it may not be for another, right? Certainly, when I go home at night, I particularly like an icebox house. My wife tends to keep it nice and warm, toasty warm, and we're always, fiddling back and forth, who's hot or cold. Similarly, your workers, right? Somebody's hot, somebody's cold. We all have that different threshold. And certainly even depending upon where you're working, you got somebody living in maybe Phoenix, Arizona, where it's 120 degrees at the peak of summer compared to somebody that's living up north, maybe in Michigan or Wisconsin, could have a lot of differences. Um, and some of you can attest to that, right? We have a large audience here nationally, and depending upon where you live, it can be different. In any case, the person living in the warmer states could be better acclimated to warmer temperatures than others. I know I've worked construction a large portion of my career, and I would have a lot of boomers that would come from northern states to the southern states, and it just took a little longer for them to get acclimated to the warmer temperatures. So whenever temperatures go above what the worker's used to, right, their body has to work harder to cool them down. Essentially, outdoor workers are not the only employees, remember that are affected by temperature extremes, as we've been talking about. Your indoor workers can certainly be exposed as well. Um, those long exposure times, remember, can put as much stress on the body as shorter times to employees. So we'll be talking about different means and measures and methods that you can be using, whether you're working indoors or outdoors, to address your heat stress dilemma. And with that, Ed's going to take us into why you should have concern for heat stress.
Yeah, and I want to add in, Ray was talking about some of the indoor places, and it can be places you don't expect. One of the industries actually listed in OSHA's national emphasis program is traveler accommodation, which would be hotels and motels. Well, the reason for that, you think, well, you've been in hotels, doesn't look like a heat stress area, but remember the laundry rooms where you've got high humidity and heat producing clothes dryers and people potentially handling heavy loads. There's a potential for heat stress. So, it's not always what you think. And that's one of the issues here. Heat stress can cause serious illnesses, especially if it's not caught right away. One of the challenges is that according to OSHA, most fatalities from outdoor where they've had them occur within the first few days, as many as 70% or more within the first week, and more than half on the very first day on the job, a fatality can occur. So heat stress is obviously a big concern. When the body is forced into overdrive, people are doing physical work, the conditions are hot, they can get serious complications. And some of those can include fatigue, as we mentioned, heat rash. If you've had that before, it's very uncomfortable. People can lose consciousness, fainting. Cramps are an early sign from dehydration too. You can get up to heat exhaustion or heat stroke. And as we said, this can even lead to death. And we do want to give an example as a case study of how this can take lives. There was a case from OSHA about a 42-year-old roofer. He was out working on an 86-degree day. He was working without breaks. And on the third day, he did feel hot and feel sick. So he stopped work and sat down in the shade. Well, later, a few of his coworkers found him lying in the shade, but he was unresponsive. And at the hospital, he was confirmed to have had heat stroke due to the prolonged exposure, and he later died. And so you got to think about not just taking breaks, but when you're starting to feel those symptoms, you need to take action, as this was what Ray was saying, that early intervention is really critical. And again, this is one of the things that OSHA was mentioning in some of their compliance directives and their requests. They actually found that when they did inspections where there was a hospitalization or a fatality because of heat illness that the employer had to report, OSHA did a heat-related inspection. 2/3 of the employers nearly had not even done training on recognizing symptoms. Now, obviously, that contributed to the potential for a hospitalization or fatality, but if they weren't even doing symptom recognition training. So what we want to talk about is some best practices that should be applied in these situations and some lessons learned. As we were saying, you do need to take steps to protect your workers, and especially new workers who may not yet be acclimated to the heat. Keep in mind, temperature wasn't the only factor in that case. The workload, roofing work can be physically demanding. The temperature played a role. Usually when you're working on a roof, there's not a lot of shade, so you're probably in direct sunlight, and those were all factors to that worker's death. But remember then, temperature isn't the sole cause. So we want to consider things like What level of physical exertion? Are we just talking about walking back and forth? Are we talking about carrying heavy items? Are we talking about digging or shoveling or using hand tools, things like that? Are people stationary? Are they moving? You know, Ray was talking about landscaping. There's a big difference between someone cutting and dragging branches versus someone driving around on the riding lawnmower. Very different physical exertion. So you do need to dig deep to find those factors beyond the ambient temperature, humidity, of course, and things like that. Now, working in the heat, whether you're indoors or outdoors, employers should have a formal plan to protect employees from heat-related illness. And again, when OSHA did these inspections, they found the majority of employers did not have a written plan. That's not required right now. If there does come out with a standard, I wouldn't be surprised if that's included in it. But in the case we just discussed, you know, the employer not only failed to have a written plan, but we're not sure what training they'd done. So they think of this written plan as your hazard assessment. Obviously, there's going to be a lot of different conditions to address, but having an on-site monitor can be one option then. So you need to identify the potential for the risks and determine what protections need to be assigned to keep your workers safe, even if it means having an on-site monitor who can tackle some of these issues. I'm going to turn it back to Ray to talk about some of those signs and symptoms.
All right, terrific. Thank you, Ed. And just to echo something that Ed had said about making sure that you have your plan. When you have your plan, ensure that you have some sort of handshaking process. If you have other facilities or you have other work sites, if people are working outdoors, make sure that your supervisors and foremans, you do a handshake with them. You've built the program, but you want to execute the program. A lot of times out in the field or in different workplaces that I've worked in, companies had great programs, but there was a disconnect with the execution and rolling it out in the workplace. So remember that it goes in hand. Build your plan and execute your plan simultaneously. With those signs and symptoms to be mindful of, part of your plan, you should be looking at, how are you going to communicate to your workers the signs and symptoms? You want to be able to teach your workers on how to spot signs for things like heat stroke and heat exhaustion, fatigue, heat rash. I used to tell my workers, don't second guess yourself. If you're feeling a bit tired, don't think, well, maybe I didn't get much sleep, or second guess other signs and symptoms. It doesn't hurt to raise your hand and just say, you know what, something feels out of the ordinary. Let's check and make sure that everything is good to go. If everything is, everybody goes back to work. But I have found that a lot of times the cases, things weren't right and somebody was having a heat stress injury, and we addressed it and they were okay. So again, reminder, feel out of the ordinary, let's address it, let's talk about it. Let's get a little bit more into those signs and symptoms. So heat stroke often occurs, right, when the body's temperature system fails. So in the case study that Ed was discussing earlier, it's likely that that employee experienced some sort of system failure amongst other symptoms, right? In addition, heat stroke occurs when the body is no longer able to produce sweat, right? So as a result, you want to look for symptoms like, is the employee hot? Do they have dry skin? They don't have any sort of perspiration, so they're not sweating. Or is the skin red in color, perhaps resembling something like a sunburn? If so, they could be having a heat stroke situation. Another common symptom of heat stroke is confusion. So watch to see if employees seem confused, or they're not sure of their workplace, surrounding or work. A lot of times I might have asked them particular questions, hey, tell me your address. Hey, where are you at today? And if they couldn't give me, basic responses to simple questions like that, I may have suspected a heat stress situation. On the flip side of that coin, heat exhaustion occurs when an employee sweats. So now we're seeing perspiration. They may appear giddy or irritable. So some obvious signs with heat exhaustion are going to be things like nausea, they're sweating profusely, perhaps even they're vomiting. So those are things that we'll want to be mindful of with heat stroke and heat exhaustion. So the next two that I'll talk about here are fatigue and heat rash. So fatigue occurs more quickly during exertion in hot conditions, right? Um, Ed made a great point. You know, if you're a landscaper and you're riding the lawnmower versus dragging branches, you would have two different elements of exertion. But again, that fatigue occurs more quickly when you're doing more exertion, especially in a hot condition, because your body's natural cooling methods are on overload, right? The more work you do, the more your body has to work to cool itself down. When the body circulates more blood to the upper layers of the skin in order to release body heat to the environment, less blood is available to provide your workers' muscles enough energy to work. So the employees might feel a bit weak, tired, or maybe unable to consistently work at a certain pace or a level. So as a result, signs that you can look for include this decline in performance or loss of coordination. I used to have workers just write it off as, it's the afternoon carbs setting in. But when we looked into it, they were actually having elements of heat stress illness. So finally, the last category there is centered around heat rash. So heat rash occurs as a result of the body's natural cooling mechanisms. And so body heat is released through sweating. And this cooling action is most effective if the sweat is able to evaporate into a dry environment. But when it's humid outside or indoors or outdoors, as we've been talking about, the skin can remain moist from that sweat, and you can have situation where pores get plugged or ducts in the skin, causing an inflammation or a rash. So those are the signs and symptoms. Those are the four main categories that I would include in your training and to talk about. And here on the next slide, we'll get a little bit more into training. As I mentioned, training certainly needs to, and Ed has mentioned it in various aspects. Training needs to be a part of your program. It could be formal training. It could be awareness training. A lot of times I would have little short 5-minute toolbox talks of sorts for supervisors to review on a day-to-day basis, and then have more of a formal program where workers would go through that on a periodic basis. Some things that we're going to be covering is obviously what is required. We'll take a look at OSHA's stance, and we'll also discuss some best practices. But before we get more into training, let me just take one question. As I mentioned, and there's a Q&A box there. Make sure you send us your questions. Somebody's asking, is there an OSHA regulation on how long somebody can work in a warm room? And this is a great question. There is no standard or regulation that covers heat stress. I will say that there's one exception. If the HAZWOPER standards apply to you, there is an element in there about the employer assessing the work environment for heat stress situations. But generally here, there is no heat stress standard, including for situations where if you're working in a warm, or how long you should be able to work in a hot or a warm room. But as Ed mentioned earlier, that general duty clause applies, right? And that requires us to do that hazard assessment. And if you find that it's a hazard to work too long in a certain condition or environment, so if I'm in a hot or warm environment, you're going to have to gauge how long is too long. And again, each employee can have different sensitivities. So again, there's no clear-cut blanket answer. Part of your assessment is looking at what your workers are doing, how long are they going to be doing it, are they wearing certain PPEs, and what's their level of exertion when you're looking into something like that. Training is important because it helps workers recognize the signs and symptoms, right? As we've been talking about of these heat-related stress injuries and illnesses amongst workers and their coworkers. But there's more to that. So things that you want to look at are you want workers to be able to recognize an emergency situation. You want workers to monitor their own physical condition, right? Especially if you have a lone worker situation. You want them, they should know what is overheating. What type of sensation is that? Why would that be an increased risk to them? They should know how to keep coolant devices on hand. Ed will be talking about that here later in the webcast, different types of PPE and coolant devices that are available out there. They should know how to drink cold fluids or maybe electrolytes if you're providing those. I've had situations where supervisors or workplaces have provided drinking water, but it was a pack of water with water bottles that was sitting in a corner that was warm to touch, or they threw it in an ice chest and they didn't throw ice in it. And so if you have that drinking water, you need to make sure that you also have that ice. So these are some examples. It's not an all-inclusive list, but these are examples of different types of trainings that you might want to consider. As you can see up on the slide there, the safety management suite that we offer at JJ Keller, it includes a lot of training resources on hundreds of topics, including heat stress. If you're there at the safety management suite, all you got to do is enter heat stress literally in the topic index, and you'll find 5-minute safety talks. You're going to find PowerPoint presentations, online courses, FAQs, and lots of articles. So if you'd like free access to all the compliance tools and resources in our safety management suite, use the poll that you see flash up on your screen to select your interests. And you should see that pop up there, and let us know your thoughts.
Oh, yeah, Ray, I got to mention, you're talking about the question of how hot is too hot. And that's, again, something that OSHA mentioned in their request for information. And we think it's fortunate OSHA understands this heat stress is complicated, but they pointed out a lot of things happen above, 77 degrees or above 80 degrees or a heat index of those levels when you start considering both ambient temperature and humidity. But OSHA had admitted that there's been serious heat illnesses at lower temperatures. And part of that is just individual differences. If you've got a much older person, maybe a little overweight and with some conditions like diabetes, they're not going to be able to handle the exertion and temperature as a much younger, healthier, physically fit person. That's one of the challenges really that OSHA is having in coming up with some of these rules, is that you've got not only such variations in temperature and geographic regions, but individual variations. And how, OSHA is trying to figure out, how do we create a rule that just says, okay, well, if it was over 80, you should have seen this. Well, okay, it was 75, but this person got heat stress anyway. It's a challenge. It'll be interesting to see what they come up with.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, I'm going to move on with training a little bit. And we did talk about obviously training to wear the PPE that's needed. And we mentioned some PPE can make things worse when you've got to wear heavy protective clothing. But you can also provide PPE that's cooling. That could include ice packs or cooling packs, wet bandanas. You've probably seen guys working, they tie a wet towel or bandana on their head or their neck. There's these other cooling devices. Make sure people know how to use these properly, and make sure that if they've got something loose like a towel around their neck, that it's not going to create additional hazards if they're using, say, tools where loose clothing is prohibited. Even if people do bring their own PPE, make sure they're using it correctly and without a hazard. And you might train people, say, to not use certain items where it could be a distraction, for example. Now, maybe a bandana would be a better choice than an ice pack in some cases, or something that could be tied tightly. Now, of course, before you assign PPE, the ideal is to have applied all feasible engineering and administrative controls. And we're going to talk about those in a bit. Obviously, we want to eliminate heat or reduce the exposure to it, but just remember, you can train workers to use those controls correctly. That includes telling what practices you've set up in the first place. We'll talk about things like rotating shifts every hour. And, really, as Ray was saying, it talks about recognition. He's got a lot of great stories about people thought, well, I had too many carbs for lunch and I'm tired here. Well, if they came back from lunch and the break is scheduled at 2:30, but they're feeling tired at 2 o'clock, You don't have to push through that last half hour. You know, take the break a little early. Let your people know that it's okay to do that, because as I was saying, there are some individual differences, and don't let them think, oh, come on, Steve, it's only another half hour. We can finish this up. You know, it's not worth putting your health at risk for something like that. So engineering controls, obviously at the top of the list would be mitigating or eliminating the hazard. In this case, the hazard being heat usually. Options for things like this: putting up an enclosed space for employees to work while they're outside. Often that's providing shade. By the way, Ray started out talking in the winter. Enclosed spaces that are heated in the winter for outdoor places can be very important, both to block wind and to create a slightly warmer microclimate. Back to heat, of course, fans for workers in one area, and using fans outdoor might seem strange, but if it's a very still day, that can work. Cooling mists, water mists can help. And again, providing shade, any kind of sun barrier that can block the shade. Even on somewhat breezy days, you could be in an area where you're behind a building or something and structures block the wind. Now, when engineering controls aren't feasible, and we understand you can't use them all the time, look to administrative controls, these work practice controls. Now, these are steps you take to control or limit the exposure duration rather than just eliminating it. Because as we said, duration is a big factor too. So you think things like scheduling, one way to keep employees out of the heat for too long. If possible, schedule that heavier labor for the cooler parts of the day, maybe early morning or late afternoon. We've had here in Wisconsin, we do get heat waves, and there's actually been times when highway work was scheduled at night. So it's much cooler. Rotating shifts between jobs. Again, one guy doesn't have to be cutting branches all day. Maybe he could take a break and drive the riding lawnmower for a bit, to use that example again. Providing cold drinks. And like Ray was saying, if those water bottles are sitting out in the sun and they're 120 degrees, people aren't going to want to drink them. Or probably not that hot, but point being, cool water will do this. And, you know, potentially people even bring in relief workers. And that's something else that OSHA was looking at, was that temps are probably not acclimated. They're not as well trained. But if you are using them, it can increase your number of workers and you can rotate people through different jobs. Turn it back to Ray to talk about weather.
All right, terrific. Thanks, Ed. So think about this. I mean, how are you getting your information when it comes to whether or not it's hot? Are there advisories? Are there heat warnings or what have you? So as you can see up here on the screen, we've provided some examples of things that you should be looking for. But you want to remember the three main ones that are available for you. There's basically three levels of alerts that you can see, and you'll find these pretty much at any of your favorite weather apps that are now available. But heat advisories, excessive heat warnings, and excessive heat watches. And I'll talk a little bit about what each of those are. So when you see the heat advisories pop up, these are issued when it's clear that people can be affected, your workers can be affected by heat, and that they'll be affected if certain precautions are not taken, right? So heat advisories are typically issued at the county level. They do differ from state to state, so you want to check your local listings and see what temperatures trigger those heat advisories. The second level there that you see is the excessive heat warning. And these are issued when it's clear that heat's going to cause some serious damage to your workers' health if those certain precautions are not taken. When excessive heat warnings are issued, certain regulations might change, and that includes outdoor work, right? Specifically, there might be a requirement that's issued by your local government to perhaps stop work outside. The third main category is obviously the excessive heat watches, and these are going to be issued when the heat warning criteria at a level 2 are certain. And that means that the National Weather Service is issuing the warning typically 1 to 2 days in advance to help people prepare for the incoming heat. And keep in mind, as I've said, that this differs from jurisdiction, as I've seen, but each jurisdiction has a little different variation in what triggers heat alerts. Certainly, I've seen geographically what is an alert down in Phoenix, Arizona is completely different in Detroit, Michigan. And so you want to be mindful of that. So talking more about safe work practices, right? Safe work practices are another way to protect our workers. So now safe work practices are an administrative control. Ed just talked about engineering controls or what have you. But they include helping workers understand how to protect themselves in hot environments and include things like your rules, company specific operations. So if you have standard operating procedures, so safe work practices can be things like you're telling your workers to dress lightly or use certain breathable materials. As I've stressed already, and Ed has, drinking plenty of cold liquids. We've seen some of the guidance on OSHA's web tools. They typically recommend anywhere between a 50 and 60 degree temperature Fahrenheit for that water. You might be asking your workers through your SOP, to work in pairs. Use the buddy system. Don't work alone. You may have conditions and controls for, hey, if you're going in between the office and where it's cooler and the hot warehouse, or going outdoors to do physical exertion under the sun, do these things. So developing things like developing your warm weather safety plan or cold stress, depending upon what time of the year it is. Those are all some examples of some administrative controls that you would couple in your safe work practices. Let's talk a little bit about some warm weather wear. It's crucial, right, that employees dress for success, we say, while they're on the job, especially in heat situations. And so that even includes dressing to protect them against things like the sun's rays, not just the heat. A lot of times in construction, you'll see that workers are wearing long sleeves. And sometimes folks think like, why aren't they wearing t-shirts or what have you? Well, the UV rays. So wearing the right kinds of clothes go a long way, right, to prevent heat-related stress. As I had also talked about, there's more breathable fabrics. A lot of technologies have evolved where there's moisture wicking fabrics to assist with the body being able to cool itself down more efficiently. I typically recommend that, if you're looking for things like vests and you're using aprons or other forms of PPE, to speak with your vendors and suppliers. They usually have the latest gauge or pulse on what are the latest trends that are available for you. And with that, Ed's going to get more into warm weather wear.
Yeah, talking about wearing the long sleeves, I actually had a roof done at my house just recently, and yeah, the guys are up there, long sleeve shirts, 80+ degree day, and but it keeps the UV off your skin, and that's important. It also helps not only avoid sunburn, it can help limit heat rash. Sunscreen works too, but wearing the right clothes can be effective. We're talking loose fitting, light colored things, breathable. A cap maybe with a wide brim to protect the ears and nose and the back of the neck and the forehead. Sunglasses, UV rays can be damaging to the eyes. And again, during the summer months, it's not just heat, it's not just strong sun that can cause problems. It's the rash. I mean, I like cotton, but the problem with cotton is it may breathe, but once it gets wet, it has to dry out. That's why we make towels out of it. There are some great wonder fabrics that can be used that breathe a lot better. They don't absorb the water like cotton. So, the cooling bandanas, those are made of cotton, but that's if it can evaporate. So keep in mind, you can assign PPE. Now, we at JJ Keller, we don't endorse third-party products, but we do endorse our own Safe Gear product line. And we do have things like portable ice packs, cooling vests, cooling towels, cooling bandanas, and portable water packs. I also want to mention, obviously, if you've heard of OSHA's exemptions for, generally employers, the OSHA expects employers to pay for PPE, but OSHA does not require paying for everyday clothing. So while we're talking about long sleeve shirts and loose fitting clothing or cotton clothing or light colored, that's not actually, that might be thought of as a kind of PPE, but if it's suitable for everyday clothing, OSHA doesn't require the employer to pay for that. So you don't have to buy these things. You're probably not required to pay for equipment that's just used to protect against normal weather. We're talking like a coat, a winter jacket for working in a cooler, or gloves for working in there. And like I said, long sleeve shirts. Do keep in mind though, when severe heat or other weather requires using some other equipment like cooling devices, then you may have to pay for that. And you can certainly provide things like those cooling bandanas. Now, I'm going to turn it back to Ray to kind of wrap us up, and then we're going to get to some of your questions. I think we've had at least a dozen come in, so keep sending them in. But Ray, I want to give you a recap, and then I'll let you look over the questions while I cover up one more thing.
Absolutely. Yeah, we covered quite a bit of material, lots of good information. I think that went quick, but we did cover a lot. So we certainly talked about what heat stress is and why it should be a concern for you, your workers within your workplace. We talked about who's at risk. We talked about not just your workers, but also looking at the various groups that are working in and around your work environment. So be mindful of that. We discussed a lot about training. JJ Keller Safety Management Suite has a lot of resources available to you, but ensuring that your program also touches on what your training program is. Ed discussed a great case study with us just to give you a real life example that you could take back and apply in your work setting. Ed and I discussed, engineering and administrative controls that you could include in your workplace plan. We certainly discussed PPE that you should be looking at, and we answered some questions along the way, and which we'll be doing here, answering more of your questions that you've submitted.
Yeah, and we're going to take your questions shortly. Again, I just want to say, if you haven't sent your questions in, you still have time to do so. I hope this webcast gave you some insight and identified some tools to help you with climate management. I know there's going to be some good questions here. Again, a lot of these tools are available in Safety Management Suite, and we're offering complimentary access to get the benefits of our most popular tools. We have written safety plans. As Ray was saying, we have training programs. We have self-inspection, self-audit checklists. We have federal regulations. And actually, if you ask questions of Safety Management Suite, experts like Ray and I will answer those questions for you. So use the poll, select your interests, and again, along with your complimentary free access, we'll give you a white paper on top EHS practices. So with that, I'm going to turn it back to our host to wrap up and start sending us some questions.
Well, thank you so much, Ray and Ed. Appreciate this presentation. And before we start the Q&A, we want to remind everyone of the evaluation survey we're asking you to complete. Your input is important because it does help us improve our future webcast. For our first question, someone asked about what's the best way to measure heat? Simply using a thermometer, or is there something else? And I think another attendee brought up wet bulb globe thermometers or wet bulb globe temperatures. So,
yeah. I'm going to ask
the best way to measure heat.
Probably the wet bulb is considered the best, and I'm going to pass this to Ray in just a second for his input, but OSHA addresses that, and they said the problem with things like temperature alone is it doesn't account for things like sunlight or humidity or air movement. And we talk about heat index, which is a big one on the weather stations. Heat index covers both heat and humidity, but again, it doesn't cover working in sunlight. It doesn't cover things like air movement. So the wet bulb actually covers a lot of those different things, and it gives you a more accurate reading. Not everyone has the capability potentially, but they are good. Ray, have you used any of those?
Yeah, I have used a wet bulb before. I think it takes a little bit of training and understanding, and so it may not be something that you can commonly use if you haven't used it before. Certainly The thermometers and things like that are more readily available, and that kind of gets you in the ballpark. I would agree with Ed that if you have the capacity or capability to use that wet bulb, that gives you a very precise measurement, because what it's doing is it's measuring the lowest temperature to which air can be cooled in your workplace by evaporation of water into the air. And so a lot of times what I would do, even the first time I got started with one, we had an IH tech, a consultant, come in and just show us how to use it and how it applies in our workplace. So if you have that ability, I recommend highly to use the wet bulb. If not, I think the basic thermometers get you in the ballpark.
Yeah, and I think OSHA NIOSH even has some apps you can download to help you evaluate temperature and weather conditions. So that's something to look at as well.
Yeah, I believe another attendee did mention the NIOSH app. Our next question is, I work at a large construction site, about 6,000 employees on the coast of Texas. And one of the biggest challenges I have as a safety manager is implementing a formalized acclimatization program. We have a robust heat stress plan, but implementing a practical acclimatization schedule for new employees and those returning from extended breaks is difficult. The NIOSH schedule is difficult to maintain with multiple employees and multiple supervisors. So if you all have any input that could help this attendee, I think he would really appreciate it.
Just as a quick background, usually what to get people to acclimated to the heat, you do the 20% rule, 20% of the usual workload on the first day, and then adding to 40, 60, 80, so that by the end of 5 days, people are doing the full workload. That's supposed to help people acclimate. But as you were saying, if someone's been gone for 2 weeks, they recommend reacclimating, but when you've got a multi-employer work site, implementing that can be tough. And I had the thought that it's also difficult to acclimate when work is intermittent. We like to think we're doing the same task all day long, but let's face it, you do different tasks, different days of the week or different parts of the day. So I can imagine that's a challenge. It's one of the things OSHA looked at. And I just wanted to throw that background out, other than saying it's an enormous challenge. Ray, do you have anything you can throw in there with your experience?
Yeah, there's two things, and I spent a lot of my time as a construction safety manager, and you'll find a lot of times we shift the work from the daytime to swing shift or even night shift because of the heat situation. I know when I worked down in Phoenix, Arizona, it was hot as hot. During the peak of sun, during the peak of the summer, it was 110, 120 degrees. And so we shifted that work process to later in the day. The other thing is buy-in. Ed talked about, the kind of the acclimatization, do we do 20% today, 50%, 60%, but getting buy-in from your supervisors. So this whole heat stress concept and it being a reality in your supervisors' minds, I would spend quite a bit of time talking to the frontline supervisors that this is a reality and showing them how these workplace adjustments can help their employees be more productive and prevent injuries, and getting their buy-in to the process. Because when you're not there to monitor, or you go back to the office and you're entrusting them to follow the program, if they bought into the program and they understand how it works and why it works, they're going to be out there with your workers, making sure that it comes to life. And so I think that the training aspect is key. And then also just looking at different shifts, if that's available for you.
Our next question, our employer supplies us with polyester PP work shirts, and they're super hot and suffocate the body and while working in a hot warehouse. So what is the best material? I know we referenced this during the presentation a little bit. What is the best material to request our shirts be made of?
I think that's going to be, part of the evaluation. If it's not working, definitely report that up and report the discomfort. Because like I said, there are some great materials. I've done backpacking. I loved backpacking in the summer, but wearing a cotton shirt was awful because it would stick to my back. And I managed to get some long sleeve shirts. They're supposed to be UV protective. I don't know what they're made of. They're polyester of some kind, but they are much more breathable and comfortable. So if you've got something that isn't working, pass that along. To me, it's no different than if your safety glasses are fogging up or other PPE doesn't fit or isn't working. then the employer needs to evaluate that and provide something that is, because the PPE should not be introducing new hazards. Ray, am I on track there?
Yeah, no, I absolutely. And, I would rely on my vendors and suppliers. As I mentioned earlier, a lot of times they have the word up on what the latest mouse traps are out there with blended fabrics and moisture wicking fabrics and things. But as Ed has mentioned several times, getting buy-in from your workers, I would suggest getting some samples of different materials, blended materials, different types of moisture wicking materials, and vendors will be happy to provide you samples. And let some of your workers try them on and see what works best for them in the different environments, because you could have a blended cotton or something like that that works well in one particular environment, and then you go inside and it doesn't work as well. So I would get your workers involved and get your suppliers and vendors to have that discussion.
Well, thank you, everyone. Unfortunately, we have run out of time today. Thank you so much to Ray Chisty, Ed Zaleski, the entire team from our sponsor, JJ Keller, and of course, all of our listeners. Take care and have a safe day.